This is Frame, and I'm your host, Dr. Julie Hunt. Today we turn our focus to one of the most consequential turning points in modern American history, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It's the event that propelled the United States fully into the Vietnam War, and it remains one of the clearest examples of how media framing can shape public understanding and ultimately national policy. Let's set the scene. In August 1964, something happened off the coast of North Vietnam that changed everything. On the night of August 2nd, 1964, the USS Maddox was on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin. It reported being attacked by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. There was an exchange of fire, 1 U.S. plane hit, a few Vietnamese boats damaged. President Lyndon Johnson quickly addresses the nation, declaring that American forces have been attacked on the high seas. 2 nights later came reports of a second attack on both the Maddox and another destroyer, the Turner Joy. But that second attack likely never happened. Bad weather, confused radar, nervous sailors seeing echoes on their screens. Still, Washington acted as if it were fact. President Johnson went on national television that night. He said, "Repeated acts of violence against the armed forces of the United States must be met not only with alert defense, but with positive reply." He asked Congress for authority to take all necessary measures to repel future aggression. From a framing perspective, this was textbook. Johnson and his team built what we might call a righteous victim frame. America wasn't the aggressor, it was the target. The language of defense, repel, protect, preserve peace, positioned the U.S. as morally justified. Communication scholar Robert Entman would later describe framing as selecting certain aspects of reality and making them more salient to promote a particular interpretation. That's exactly what Johnson's advisors did: highlight danger, minimize uncertainty, and give the nation a clean moral line. And because television was still new as a political medium, the visuals amplified it. The president, calm, determined, with flags behind him, became part of the message. Johnson framed the incident as a direct, unprovoked act of aggression, positioning America as the victim and moral defender of freedom. Within 48 hours, the Senate passed the resolution 88-2. It was effectively a blank check for war. That authority became the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and it opened the door to full-scale U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But what really happened? Here's the question that has haunted historians and journalists ever since. Did that second attack really happen? And maybe more importantly, how was it framed? Because framing isn't just how stories are told, it's how meaning gets built. The Tonkin incident wasn't only a military episode, it was a communication event. It showed how information, emotion, and political need can combine to shape what the public believes. As we'll explore, what unfolded in those few days in August 1964 became not only a military turning point, but a masterclass in how frames are constructed, amplified, and eventually questioned. The Gulf of Tonkin incident didn't just happen on the sea, it happened in the mind of the public. And that mind was shaped by the frame that President Johnson and his administration presented. They described the attacks as deliberate and repeated acts of aggression. That wording, deliberate and repeated, mattered. It implied clear intent by North Vietnam, and it gave the United States moral and political justification to retaliate. In this moment, the administration activated what communication scholars call a crisis frame, one that stresses urgency, unity, and moral clarity. It positioned America as a victim of external hostility and cast dissent as disloyalty. But here's where framing theory becomes especially powerful. According to Robert Entman, framing selects certain aspects of reality and makes them more salient, shaping how audiences define problems, assign blame, and suggest remedies. Johnson's televised remarks did exactly that. They defined the problem, communist aggression. They identified the cause, North Vietnam's hostility. They offered a moral evaluation, that freedom itself was under attack, and they proposed a solution, a measured but forceful American response. Framing is remarkably durable. Once it's introduced by a credible authority, the president in this case, it becomes the lens through which all future events are interpreted. Journalists echoed it, congressmen endorsed it, and ordinary citizens accepted it. The initial framing created a feedback loop between the White House, the media, and the public. Each reinforced the other's sense of urgency, and with every new headline, the frame grew stronger. Even skeptics found it difficult to question the narrative without appearing unpatriotic. That's the power and the peril of an early and dominant frame. Inside the Johnson White House, politics and perception were inseparable. Lyndon Johnson was a master politician, a man who understood that how something was seen could matter more than what actually happened. By 1964, Johnson faced an election year and an America deeply uneasy about the Cold War. He had inherited John F. Kennedy's vision of a strong, determined United States, but he also inherited the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis and a country still mourning its fallen president. Behind the scenes, Johnson and his advisors were walking a tightrope. They feared appearing weak against communism, especially with critics in Congress, like Barry Goldwater, accusing them of being soft on defense. So when reports of the second Gulf of Tonkin attack arrived, they didn't just see a military event, they saw an opportunity to reaffirm American strength, to show the world and the voting public that the United States would not back down. Domestic politics, foreign policy, and media framing collided in that moment. As Johnson prepared his televised address, every word was chosen to evoke clarity, resolve, and reassurance. There was no mention of the uncertainty in the radar signals, no mention of conflicting reports from the Navy captains. Instead, the story became simple. America was attacked, and America responded. This was the political logic of the Cold War, where ambiguity was dangerous and strength was safety. Johnson understood the psychology of a public still haunted by fears of communist expansion from Korea to Cuba to Vietnam. To understand why Johnson moved so fast, we have to step into his world in 1964. The country he led was in transformation and turmoil. Just 1 month earlier, Johnson had signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It outlawed segregation in schools, workplaces, and public spaces, and a moral breakthrough, but a political earthquake. Southern Democrats, once Johnson's base, felt betrayed. Civil rights marches filled the streets. The Ku Klux Klan was on the attack. The South was slipping from Democratic hands. At the same time, Johnson was unveiling his grand Great Society vision, programs to fight poverty, expand education, and lift up the disadvantaged. It was sweeping, expensive, and it depended on a Congress that could just as easily turn on him. Then came the 1964 presidential race. His opponent, Barry Goldwater, was calling him soft on communism, reckless abroad, weak at home. Goldwater's rhetoric was fiery, even hinting that nuclear force might be an option in Vietnam. So when the Tonkin cables arrived, Johnson saw more than a military report. He saw a chance to reframe himself, the steady, decisive defender of freedom. A strong America abroad meant a stable America at home. From a communication standpoint, Tonkin became a kind of domestic unifier. Johnson used it to redirect national attention from racial conflict and legislative battles to a story that felt morally simple. In framing theory, this is known as frame redirection, using an external threat to manage internal tension. By defining Tonkin as an act of aggression, Johnson could present himself as both protector and peacemaker. It reassured the public that democracy still worked, that leadership was firm, that the president was in control. Sociologist William Gambson might call this a frame contest, a battle over meaning. Johnson needed his definition of reality to dominate, and for a time it did. His approval soared, reporters echoed the administration's language, even skeptics hesitated. No one wanted to look un-American in an election year. Additionally, for many Americans, the tension between communism and democracy wasn't abstract. It lived in their daily lives, in the classroom's air raid drills, in the family dinner debates about the draft, in the patriotic movies and evening newscasts. Business leaders feared global instability. Mothers feared their sons being sent to war. Children learned that the enemy was invisible but everywhere. So when Johnson spoke that August night, his words didn't just describe an event, they confirmed an expectation. They reinforced an existing frame of the world as divided between freedom and tyranny, good and evil, democracy and oppression. That's why the Gulf of Tonkin narrative resonated so powerfully. It didn't invent fear, it organized it. At first, the Gulf of Tonkin story held firm. The press, Congress, and the public accepted it as truth. The frame was clear and comforting. America was attacked, and America defended itself. For ordinary Americans, the story fit perfectly with the world they already knew. Communism was the global villain, democracy the hero. So the idea that North Vietnam would attack U.S. ships seemed logical, expected even. In 1964, there was no internet, no alternative media, no social media chatter to complicate the picture. Just 3 networks, 1 story, 1 frame. Walter Cronkite, Chet Huntley, David Brinkley all delivered the same message, an unprovoked act of aggression met by American resolve. And because people trusted television then, the image of Johnson behind the desk carried real emotional weight. It said, the adults are in charge. The world still makes sense. This is what media scholar Todd Gitlin later called media hegemony, the way news organizations, without conspiracy or instruction, reinforce the dominant worldview simply by following their routines. Frames aren't enforced from the top down. They're co-produced through culture, habit, and professional norms. In 1964, those norms valued unity over dissent. Questioning a president during a military crisis felt like betrayal. That's why the Gulf of Tonkin frame lasted so long. It was emotionally comfortable. It told Americans their leaders were honest and their cause was righteous. And in times of uncertainty, comfort can outweigh truth. But durability isn't permanent. As the war deepened, the clean narrative began to erode. Facts leaked. Soldiers came home. Television cameras started showing a different kind of truth, but within months, small cracks began to appear. Reporters started to notice inconsistencies in the Navy's after-action reports. Radar evidence was inconclusive. Sonar logs didn't quite match up. Even the Maddox's captain expressed doubts about what he had actually seen. Things were falling apart. For the first time, journalists began to rekey the event, a concept from Erving Goffman's framing theory. To rekey means to reinterpret a familiar story when new information disrupts the existing frame. The Gulf of Tonkin story, once a clear case of aggression, was now being redefined as a possible mistake or even a manipulation. One of the first to see these cracks was Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon. He had voted against the Tonkin resolution, one of only 2 senators to do so. Morse warned that Congress had handed the president a blank check for war. He didn't believe the second attack had been verified, and he called for hearings. At the time, most of Washington dismissed him as eccentric, even disloyal, but his challenge planted a seed. That same autumn, reporters at the New York Times began digging. Their Pentagon sources quietly admitted that the second attack might never have happened. The Times ran cautious stories, couched in the language of uncertainty, but they marked the start of something new, the press beginning to rekey the event. In framing theory, rekeying happens when an existing frame no longer fits reality. Reporters, politicians, and audiences start redefining what's going on. What had once been unprovoked aggression began to sound like a possible misunderstanding. The tone changed from certainty to doubt. Inside newsrooms, editors were uneasy. No one wanted to accuse a president of deception, especially a president who had just won in a landslide. But the facts kept shifting. Radar logs were ambiguous. Communication intercepts were incomplete, and deep down, journalists sensed the first tremor of mistrust that would later shake American media for a generation. This was the beginning of frame erosion, when cracks appear in the dominant narrative and competing frames start to emerge. Political communication scholar Robert Entman would say the salience of one interpretation begins to fade, making space for another. In this case, Johnson's defense frame slowly lost credibility to a credibility frame. The story was no longer American response to aggression, but did the president mislead the nation? This shift didn't happen overnight. For months, the mainstream press still echoed the official line, but smaller papers, foreign correspondents, and university journalists began pushing harder. They were no longer content with the simple morality play of good and evil. They wanted evidence. And in that push, you can see the early stages of what would become the adversarial turn in journalism. The idea that holding power accountable was as patriotic as supporting it. By early 1965, as troops poured into Vietnam and casualty numbers climbed, that seed of doubt became public conversation. Morse's warnings didn't sound eccentric anymore. They sounded prophetic. And the press, once united by loyalty, began to fracture along new lines. This was the beginning of frame erosion, when cracks appear in the dominant narrative and competing frames start to emerge. Political communication scholar Robert Entman would say the salience of one interpretation begins to fade, making space for another. In this case, Johnson's defense frame slowly lost credibility to a credibility frame. The story was no longer American response to aggression, but did the president mislead the nation? This shift didn't happen overnight. For months, the mainstream press still echoed the official line, but smaller papers, foreign correspondents, and university journalists began pushing harder. They were no longer content with the simple morality play of good and evil. They wanted evidence. And in that push, you can see the early stages of what would become the adversarial turn in journalism. The idea that holding power accountable was as patriotic as supporting it. By early 1965, as troops poured into Vietnam and casualty numbers climbed, that seed of doubt became public conversation. Morse's warnings didn't sound eccentric anymore. They sounded prophetic. And the press, once united by loyalty, began to fracture along new lines. Those still operating inside the Johnson frame and those looking for an alternative. In this moment, the media's tone shifted from patriotic unity to cautious skepticism. The New York Times in particular started asking harder questions, publishing reports that hinted at uncertainty within the administration. Their journalists pushed against the original crisis frame, challenging whether the second attack had ever actually happened. This process of rekeying didn't happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, as leaked documents and insider accounts painted a more complicated picture. By the late 1960s, it was becoming clear that the Johnson administration had exaggerated, perhaps even invented, key details of the incident to secure public support for escalation. And with that revelation, the Gulf of Tonkin frame began to erode. It's what communication theorists call frame erosion, when the dominant narrative loses its power because new information, new actors, and new frames take hold. Once that happened, journalists began revisiting the story with new questions about credibility, transparency, and trust. The incident that once unified the nation was now dividing it. By 1966, the Vietnam story was starting to change on its own. The body counts were climbing, victory kept moving further away, and television was bringing the war into America's living rooms night after night. For the first time, Americans were seeing what war actually looked like. Villages burning, soldiers crying, wounded civilians being carried to helicopters. Those pictures clashed with the calm, confident briefings from the White House, and that clash produced something new in modern politics, what journalists began calling the credibility gap. The credibility gap wasn't just about facts, it was about trust. When Johnson said, "Light at the end of the tunnel," people at home saw only smoke and fire. When generals promised progress, the nightly news showed funerals. The government's frame of resolve, honor, and containment was colliding with an emerging frame of futility and moral doubt. In framing theory, this is what we call frame contestation, the moment when multiple competing versions of reality fight for dominance. Political sociologists David Snow and Robert Benford describe it as a struggle over diagnosis, prognosis, and motivation. Who's to blame? What should be done? And why should anyone care? Each side offers its own answers. The Johnson administration diagnosed the problem as communist aggression. Its prognosis: escalate, contain, win. Its motivation: defend freedom. The anti-war movement diagnosed it differently: imperial overreach and deception. Their prognosis: withdraw. Their motivation: save lives and moral integrity. The media found itself in the middle of that contest. Reporters who once trusted official briefings now question them in public. Editors argued over tone, how to balance patriotism with skepticism. And on the streets, protesters carried signs that said, "Who's lying now?" The credibility gap wasn't just a slogan, it became a frame in itself, a lens through which every government statement was filtered. Once that frame took hold, almost every subsequent announcement about Vietnam was received with doubt. This marks a turning point in the history of American journalism. The adversarial turn, born in the shadow of Tonkin, was now fully visible. Journalists no longer assumed that leaders told the truth by default. They asked for documents, demanded proof, and eventually printed leaks. From a theoretical standpoint, this is where the Tonkin frame undergoes slippage. What began as a clear story of good versus evil rekeyed into a story of confusion, contradiction, and betrayal. Frame slippage, as Tuckman, Entman, and Rees have each discussed in different ways, happens when the public no longer accepts the premise that once defined the issue. The symbols lose their power, the narrative loses coherence. And once a frame slips, it rarely snaps back. It fractures into new ones. For Vietnam, those new frames were the quagmire, the unjust war, and later the tragic mistake. Each one carried its own moral logic, its own political energy, and its own audience. By 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. himself had joined the anti-war movement, linking the costs of Vietnam to poverty and racial injustice at home. His famous words at Riverside Church, "The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government," signaled that the contest had spilled beyond politics. It had become moral, spiritual, generational. And as that moral contest deepened, the soldiers coming home carried its weight. They weren't returning as heroes. They were walking into a nation that didn't know what to believe anymore. That's where we'll turn next, when the human aftermath becomes part of the reframing story. By the early 1970s, the story of Vietnam was no longer just overseas. It was coming home, in hospital beds, folded flags, and faces that looked older than their years. The soldiers who returned didn't march through parades. Many stepped off planes in silence, told to change out of uniform before leaving the base. For the first time in modern American history, veterans came home to ambivalence, even hostility. Some were met with questions instead of gratitude. Why did you go? Do you still believe it was worth it? These weren't accusations so much as signs of a country that no longer shared a single story about the war. The heroic frame that had launched the conflict had collapsed, and nothing had replaced it yet. Communication scholar W. Lance Bennett calls this the spiral of scandal, a process where official narratives unravel through contradiction and disbelief until cynicism becomes the new normal. By the end of the Vietnam era, that cynicism wasn't limited to government. It touched institutions, the press, even the language of patriotism itself. In framing terms, this was the long aftermath of frame erosion. When a dominant frame finally disintegrates, it leaves behind a vacuum, a search for meaning. Different groups rush to fill that space with new interpretations. For veterans, one frame emphasized sacrifice and endurance. For peace activists, another emphasized loss and moral reckoning. And for much of the public, the war simply faded into weariness, a desire to move on. Yet the story didn't end in silence. In 1982, something remarkable rose from the ground in Washington, D.C., the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. a black granite wall sunken into the earth, inscribed with more than 58,000 names. At first, the design was controversial. There were no flags, no soldiers, no overt heroism, just names. Critics called it too bleak, too abstract, but over time it became a site of reconciliation. When visitors touched the wall, they weren't celebrating victory or condemning defeat. They were acknowledging loss. That's the essence of a closure frame, a narrative that transforms conflict into contemplation, tragedy into shared memory. From a framing theory perspective, the memorial rekeyed the Vietnam story once more. It turned a national argument into a personal act of remembrance. Each reflection on that polished stone showed not ideology, but humanity. When the memorial was dedicated, it marked not only a place of mourning, it represented a new way of framing the entire Vietnam experience. For years, America had spoken of the war through the lenses of politics and blame. But Mayan Lin's minimalist design stripped away all of that. No speeches, no heroes, no justification, just absence made visible. That choice was radical. It forced viewers to interpret the war for themselves. Each person standing before the wall participated in what scholars call collective reframing, a process of rebuilding shared meaning through personal encounter. The wall was, and still is, a mirror. Visitors see the engraved names, and beside them, their own reflections. It's a visual dialogue between the living and the dead, the political and the personal. By reflecting the viewer, the memorial makes memory participatory. It pulls each person into the act of reconciliation. From a communication standpoint, the wall serves as a rekeying device. It shifts the meaning of Vietnam from policy to people, from ideology to empathy. This is how reframing happens at a cultural level, when the symbols of a national trauma are reinterpreted through art, ritual, and silence rather than through argument. Over time, this reframing helped transform public language around Vietnam. Instead of failure, people began saying sacrifice. Instead of defeat, they said healing. The wall gave permission to grieve, and that act of shared grief became the new frame of remembrance. In this way, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial completed a communication cycle from construction to erosion to redefinition, from the official frame of duty to the oppositional frame of protest to the reconciliatory frame of remembrance. And perhaps that's the lasting lesson of Vietnam. Frames can mislead, distort, and divide, but they can also heal. When society chooses to remember differently, it begins to think differently, and in time to become different. Scholars like Piers Robinson remind us that the Gulf of Tonkin incident didn't just launch a war, it launched a feedback loop between media, policy, and perception. Government framed events to build support. The media echoed those frames, then challenged them. Public opinion shifted, reshaping policy in turn. That loop of construction, erosion, and reconstruction still defines how we experience political crises today. The Vietnam experience taught Americans that information isn't neutral. It's chosen, structured, and delivered through the frames we create. And those frames, once set in motion, can outlast the moment that made them. I'm Dr. Julie Hunt, and this has been Frame. If you'd like to explore how these communication frames echo through later conflicts from Watergate to modern wars, visit my blog at zephaniahcreative.substack.com. And for deeper dives into framing theory, join me on Patreon, where I share extended analyses and behind-the-scenes material. because in the end, the way we tell our stories is the way we understand our history.